Your morning bowl of oatmeal carries the DNA of a master criminal. That comforting breakfast staple descends from one of the most successful con artists in natural history, a weed that spent thousands of years perfecting the ultimate disguise. While our ancestors labored in their fields, carefully tending what they believed were their chosen crops, an elaborate deception was unfolding beneath their hands. This isn't about humanity's brilliant mastery of agriculture. It's about how plants outsmarted us. 10,000 years ago, our Neolithic ancestors thought they were in control. They domesticated emmer wheat and barley in the fertile valleys of the Middle East, transforming from wandering hunters into settled farmers. They built civilizations around these golden grains, spending countless hours weeding their fields with meticulous care, pulling every unwanted plant that dared invade their agricultural paradise. But lurking among those pristine rows of wheat, wild grasses were watching, learning, adapting. The farmers created deadly evolutionary pressure without realizing it. Look like wheat or die. Any wild grass that stood out, with different leaves, unusual height, or distinctive seed heads, got spotted and yanked from the earth before it could reproduce. But those rare mutants that happened to resemble wheat just a little more closely, they survived the weeding. They lived to pass on their genes. Generation after generation, an arms race played out in these ancient fields. On one side stood humans with their hands and tools, determined to purify their crops. On the other side crouched the weeds, evolving in real time to become perfect imposters. Our ancestors didn't understand they weren't just growing food. They were training master mimics. The wild ancestors of oats and rye began this con as obvious intruders, but through a process so subtle it remained invisible for millennia, they transformed themselves into nearly perfect wheat doubles. They grew to the same height. They evolved seeds of identical weight and size. They even synchronized their life cycles to ripen at precisely the same moment as their host crops. When harvest time came, farmers unknowingly gathered these botanical con artists right alongside their precious wheat. During winnowing, when grain was separated from chaff by tossing it into the wind, the mimic seeds proved their deception complete. They were now so perfectly matched to wheat that they fell into the keeper pile, while obvious weed seeds blew away with the waste. The final trick? These plants convinced humans to plant them again the following spring, hidden within the seed grain farmers saved for next year's crop. The Fertile Crescent, modern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, was where it happened. Around 8000 BCE, in the valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, people stopped wandering and started farming. They picked emmer wheat and hulled barley, not randomly. These two grasses had something the others didn't. Big seeds that stayed on the stalk until you cut them down. Most wild grasses just scatter their seeds everywhere, which makes them useless if you're trying to harvest something. Emmer wheat gave you flour, barley gave you food, and eventually beer. They were the obvious choices, but the second those first fields got planted, other grasses showed up. Wild ones, weedy relatives that nobody asked for. They just appeared between the rows. Ancestors of oats and rye, mostly, and started growing right alongside the crops. Farmers hated them. These plants stole water, blocked sunlight, took up space that should have gone to wheat and barley, so they pulled them. Every day, they'd walk the fields and yank out anything that looked wrong. A stalk too tall, leaves shaped funny, seeds that didn't match. Gone. They thought they were just weeding. They didn't realize they were running an evolutionary filter. Because here's what happened. The weeds that looked too different got ripped out before they could make seeds. The ones that looked a little more like wheat or barley, those survived. And their offspring inherited whatever trait made them harder to spot. It wasn't intentional on anyone's part. The farmers were just trying to grow food. The plants were just trying to survive. But the result was the same. Generation after generation, only the best mimics made it. Random mutations that made a rye plant shorter, or gave an oat plant leaves closer to wheat's shape, suddenly mattered in a way they never had before. In the wild, those traits might have been neutral, or even bad. In a farmer's field, they were the difference between life and death. So the weeds adapted. Slowly. Too slowly for any one person to notice. But over centuries, wild oats started looking more like wheat. Wild rye started matching barley's height, its seed head shape, the way it grew. The plants weren't conscious of this. Farmers weren't either. But the pattern was there. Humans kept pulling the obvious fakes, and the convincing ones kept reproducing. The weeds were learning to hide in plain sight, trained by the very people trying to get rid of them. The weeds were learning the rules. To survive in farmed fields, they needed to pass 3 different tests. Each part of the farming cycle could kill them if they got it wrong. The first test was visual. Farmers walked their fields during growing season, looking for anything off. A wild oat with leaves that were too narrow stood out. Plants that clumped instead of growing in rows got noticed. Anything with weird flowering patterns got pulled. The mimics that made it through this round had evolved leaves, stems, and growth patterns that looked almost exactly like wheat. Looking right was just the start. The second test came at harvest. Farmers cut their grain with stone sickles, and timing mattered. Crops that ripened too early scattered their seeds before anyone could harvest them. Those that ripened late got left behind in empty fields, eaten by animals or killed by frost. The successful mimics synchronized their whole life cycle to wheat and barley. Through mutations and selection pressure, they adjusted when they sprouted, how fast they grew when they flowered. By the time the farmer's sickle came through, these plants were ready at exactly the same moment as the real crops. The final test was the hardest. After harvest, farmers processed grain through threshing and winnowing. They beat the stalks with wooden flails to knock seeds loose, then tossed everything into the air on flat baskets. Wind carried away the light chaff and small seeds. The heavy, mature grains fell back into the basket. This part demanded precise mimicry. Wild seeds that were too small blew away with the waste. Seeds with odd shapes might get spotted and picked out. Only the ones that matched the exact size, weight, and density of wheat or barley made it through and got stored for next year's planting. Winnowing mattered more than the other tests because it didn't just determine survival, it determined reproduction. Seeds that passed winnowing got planted the following spring. The farmer thought he was selecting the best wheat. Really, he was making sure the best mimics reproduced in bigger numbers next year. Each generation refined the deception. Random mutations that made them slightly better mimics meant survival and reproduction. The ones that couldn't pull off the disguise got eliminated before they could pass on their genes. After hundreds of generations, these plants had become nearly perfect copies of the crops they'd infiltrated. Wild oats developed seeds so close to wheat that they became almost impossible to tell apart during processing. Wild rye perfected its barley impression, matching not just looks, but the physical properties that mattered during winnowing. These plants had hacked the human decision-making process. They'd figured out how to exploit our pattern recognition and our farming techniques. What made the deception work was that nobody could see it happening. No individual farmer watched the gradual changes across centuries. To each generation, the weeds in their fields looked like the same problem their fathers and grandfathers had dealt with. They couldn't know these plants were actively evolving to become more convincing every season. By the time the mimicry was complete, these descendants of wild grasses looked more like wheat and barley than like their own wild ancestors. The weeds had infiltrated human agriculture without force. They'd done it through the most sophisticated evolutionary disguise ever documented. In the early decades of the 20th century, a Russian botanist named Nikolai Vavilov was traveling through the rugged mountains of Afghanistan when he noticed something strange. Vavilov wasn't just any scientist. Born in 1887, he'd spent his life obsessed with one thing: ending human hunger by understanding where our food crops came from. He thought that somewhere in the world's remote valleys and ancient farming regions were the genetic keys to feeding humanity's future. His mission was to find them before they disappeared. By the 1920s, Vavilov had already set up the world's first comprehensive seed bank in Leningrad. But collecting specimens wasn't enough. He needed to understand how these crops had evolved in the first place, so he traveled to over 60 countries, from the Ethiopian highlands to the terraced fields of Peru, always searching for the wild ancestors of cultivated plants. During one of these journeys, while examining wheat fields in the Hindu Kush Mountains, Vavilov saw something odd. Field after field, he found wheat crops heavily infested with wild rye. But this wasn't ordinary rye. It looked almost identical to the wheat it grew alongside. The resemblance was so precise that local farmers often couldn't tell them apart until after harvest. Vavilov's trained eye caught what others had missed. This wasn't coincidence. The rye in these fields looked far more like wheat than the wild rye growing outside the farms. Something was shaping these weeds to mimic the crops they lived among. As he traveled through other regions, the fields of Turkey, the ancient farming terraces of Armenia, the mountain valleys of Georgia, Vavilov found the same pattern repeated. Everywhere he looked, he discovered crop mimics, wild oats that perfectly resembled barley, rye that matched wheat so closely it fooled experienced farmers and other weedy grasses that had evolved uncanny similarities to local cultivated varieties. Vavilov realized he was watching evolution in action, driven by human farming. Farmers had accidentally created a selection pressure so powerful it could reshape entire species. The weeds that survived weren't the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the best actors. He called this Vavilovian mimicry and developed a theory that would change botanical understanding. These plants, he argued, began as secondary crops, weeds that became so good at impersonating primary crops that they domesticated themselves. Humans hadn't chosen to grow oats and rye. These plants had tricked humans into growing them. Vavilov's insights went beyond observation. He understood that these mimic crops had something valuable, the genetic diversity that thousands of years of wild evolution had built into them. While primary crops like wheat had been selectively bred for specific traits, the secondary crops kept the genetic complexity that made them adaptable to harsh conditions. This became central to Vavilov's broader vision. He thought agricultural diversity was humanity's insurance policy against famine. In his travels, he identified 8 centers of origin where the world's major food crops had first been domesticated, and he worked constantly to collect and preserve seeds from these regions before modern agriculture could wipe out ancient varieties. But Vavilov's scientific triumph became his personal tragedy. In the Soviet Union of the 1930s, genetics was becoming politically dangerous. Joseph Stalin favored the pseudoscientific theories of Trofim Lysenko, who claimed that acquired characteristics could be inherited and that Soviet agriculture could be improved through ideology rather than genetics. Vavilov's emphasis on genetic diversity and careful breeding contradicted Lysenko's promises of quick agricultural miracles. In 1940, at the height of his international reputation, Vavilov was arrested by the NKVD and charged with being a British spy and sabotaging Soviet agriculture. The evidence against him was fabricated, but in Stalin's Soviet Union, scientific truth didn't matter as much as political convenience. While Vavilov sat in prison, his life's work faced destruction. His seed collection, containing over 200,000 varieties from around the world, was threatened by neglect and wartime chaos. During the siege of Leningrad, Vavilov's colleagues barricaded themselves inside the seed bank, protecting the collection even as they starved. Several scientists died of hunger rather than eat the seeds they were guarding. Vavilov himself never saw his vindication. In 1943, the man who had dedicated his life to understanding food and preventing famine died of starvation in a Saratov prison camp. He was 55 years old. The cruel irony of Vavilov's death became apparent only later. His theories about crop origins and genetic diversity proved foundational to modern agriculture. His identification of secondary crops and mimicry patterns helped explain how some of humanity's most important food sources had actually come into cultivation. The very plants he studied, the hardy oats and rye that had evolved as crop mimics, would prove essential for feeding populations in challenging climates where primary crops failed. The mimics had perfected their disguise, but the real test came later. For thousands of years, they'd survived as stowaways in Mediterranean fields, hiding among wheat and barley that thrived in warm, predictable climates. Then humans started pushing agriculture into places where that disguise would end up saving them. Populations grew, fertile land got scarce, and farmers moved north into the harsh landscapes of Central and Northern Europe. They brought their precious seed grain, the wheat and barley that had built civilizations in the sunny, fertile crescent. But they also brought something else without realizing it. The descendants of ancient weeds, perfectly disguised, mixed into their carefully saved seed stocks. The farmers thought their crops would flourish in these new lands, just like they had in the south. They were wrong. Wheat and barley, bred for Mediterranean sunshine and steady seasons, struggled badly in the cold, wet, unpredictable climates of northern Europe. A late spring frost could kill wheat shoots before they took root. Summer rains that went on for weeks instead of days could rot barley in the fields before harvest. Winters lasted longer and hit harder than anything these crops had evolved for, leaving seed grain frozen in the ground. When the primary crops failed, something unexpected kept growing. The stowaways, those descendants of wild mountain grasses that had spent millennia looking like wheat and barley, turned out to have a hidden advantage. Under their cultivated disguise sat the genetic memory of where they'd come from. Wild oats evolved in harsh mountains where summers were short and winters brutal. Wild rye adapted to poor soils and weather patterns that would kill more delicate plants. They'd learned to look like Mediterranean crops, sure, but they'd never lost their toughness. Wheat withered in a killing frost. The oat mimics stopped growing, waited, then picked back up when spring returned. Barley rotted in waterlogged fields. Rye mimics thrived in the same conditions. Their roots built to pull nutrients from soils too poor and wet for wheat. Farmers had to choose: abandon the fields and starve, or harvest what was left, the weeds that survived when everything else died. Desperation changed things. These plants that had been pulled from fields as worthless now meant the difference between eating and famine. Farmers started deliberately planting and tending the crops that had evolved to mimic their original choices. The shift happened fast. Within a few generations, rye became the foundational grain of northern Europe. It could grow in sandy, acidic soils where wheat failed, which made it essential across the forests and mountains of Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia. Farmers figured out how to work with it, developing dense, dark breads that could feed families through long winters. Oats did the same thing, becoming the defining crop of Scotland, Ireland, and other northern places where the growing season was too short and cool for wheat or barley. Scottish farmers found that oats could handle conditions harsh enough to kill almost every other cultivated plant. Climate itself became an evolutionary pressure as strong as human selection. The same brutal conditions that wiped out the primary crops gave the secondary crops perfect pressure to drop their disguise and show what they really were. They didn't need to hide among wheat and barley anymore. They could optimize for survival in their new northern homes. An evolutionary arms race between farmers and weeds had turned into something like partnership. The plants that survived through deception now survived by being genuinely useful, more useful, actually, than the crops they'd mimicked. There's a real irony here. Farmers spent thousands of years trying to wipe these plants out, unknowingly training them to become perfect imposters. Then, in climates where wheat and barley couldn't make it, these same weeds became humanity's lifeline. Climate revealed the final twist. The plants that learned to look like crops to avoid getting pulled had kept something the pampered primary crops lost: the genetic resilience to survive in an unpredictable world. The stowaways had finished their transformation. They weren't pretending anymore. In northern Europe's tougher climates, these former weeds started running whole economies. Rye, the plant that spent centuries perfecting its wheat costume, became the staple grain from the Rhine to the Urals. That dense, dark bread it made, it kept Germanic and Slavic populations alive through winters that would have killed off wheat-dependent communities. Oats did even better in the Scottish Highlands. The grain that survived by copying barley now grew in places where barley could barely sprout. Highland farmers found oats would grow in thin, acidic soil at altitudes that killed everything else. The porridge that fueled Scottish clansmen through centuries of fighting came straight from those old botanical fakes. Their deceptive past had left them with something valuable: genetic insurance. These plants still carried the survival skills they'd built up over thousands of years, both in the wild and sneaking through cultivated fields. Wheat and barley had been bred into softer, needier versions of themselves. Rye and oats kept their genetic range intact, which meant they could handle conditions their former hosts couldn't. These weeds pulled off something strange in domestication history. They domesticated themselves. The disguise worked so well that by the time it was over, they'd become essential. Farmers didn't grow them by choice at first, but whole regional economies ended up depending on crops that started as pests in their fields. The takeover went further. In colder regions, rye often out-yielded wheat. Oat crops proved steadier than barley. The imitators had become more important than the originals. This old biological con changed the path of human civilization. The tough crops that came out of all that evolutionary trickery let humans settle in places that should have been too harsh for farming. Without rye, Central Europe's forests probably wouldn't have supported large farming populations. Without oats, the Scottish Highlands would have stayed empty margins, too rough for real agriculture. The weeds hadn't just fooled individual farmers. They'd hacked the entire system of human food production. What started as botanical deception in ancient fields rewired human civilization. The hardy imposters became the foundation for entire cultures. They let humans spread into territories that would have stayed uninhabitable wilderness. This was coevolution on a massive scale, playing out over thousands of years without either side fully understanding the game. Humans thought they were controlling agriculture, carefully selecting and cultivating their chosen plants, but they'd become unwitting partners in an evolutionary dance where the plants were leading. The lesson goes beyond ancient history. Today's agricultural challenges, climate change, crop failures, the need for genetic diversity, echo the same patterns Vavilov saw in those Afghan wheat fields. The weeds won their ancient game by keeping the genetic flexibility that purebred crops had lost. Nature had been playing chess while humanity was playing checkers. When you eat oatmeal or rye bread, you're not eating what humans chose. You're eating the descendants of weeds that pulled off a con that lasted thousands of years. These plants spent millennia learning to mimic crops, shaped by human hands into perfect fakes, then showed their real worth exactly when we had no other options. Evolution doesn't always reward strength. Sometimes it rewards the ability to blend in until the moment is right.